Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Stark Tank, the podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. My name is Yaakov Wolf. As I began to prepare for the Yomim Noraim, I quickly ran into a problem. This is my first time experiencing Elul after my time in yeshiva, and I realized that so many of the central ideas which I had found so meaningful and inspiring are barely relevant anymore. So I sat down with Rabbi Moshe Taragin, who is one of the most insightful thinkers out there. He spoke about God awareness in the business world, the dynamic between personal responsibility and being a part of the klal, and what it means to have a tafkid in life. Taragin also surprised me when he opened up about his own career in the rabbinate, and he said something which I found very moving. Rabbi Taragin also just completed 2 different books, one about the war in Eretz Yisrael and one on the topic of Geula. You will hear more about these books in our conversation, and you can order them at the link in the show notes. We'd like to take this opportunity to wish you and your families Ashana Tova Umituka. May we be blessed with a year of good health, happiness, and growth in Avodas Hashem. And now, here's our conversation with Rabbi Moshe Taragin. So we're going to try to prepare for the Yomim Noraim together. And for me, this is my first Yomim Noraim post-yeshiva. And I wanted to discuss some of the ideas which I found very central and important in yeshiva and try to translate them to life in the working world, life post-yeshiva, which is what this podcast is really all about. And the first is an idea that I read from Rav Aaron Lichtenstein. It's published not in his sefer on Teshuva, rather in an essay called Teshuva in the sefer By His Light, where he talks about 2 dimensions where we can think about averas. We can talk about misplaced passions, that's called avodah zara, or we can talk about a lack of passion, which he calls shechicha. And he says that, in his opinion, one of the central issues, the sins that crouch at the door of the centrist, the Tilumi community, is this lack of passion, this lack of feeling an imminent sense of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this, according to the introduction, is from a Shabbos Shuvah drasha that Rav Lichtenstein gave in 1987, so almost 40 years ago. And I'm wondering, just to open up, to what extent do you think that this is still true, this diagnostic is still relevant today, almost 40 years later?
It's a good question, and certainly I was just thinking to myself over Shabbos how comforting it is to return every Elul to my Rosh Yeshivos and to their Torah and to their just mind space of Teshuva, and especially this year when it's so confusing. Everything Rav Lichtenstein wrote is kind of around it. At 2 Rosh Yeshivos, everything Rav Amital wrote was periodic. You're very, very, it's very dangerous to cut and paste and even to transfer 30, 40 years later. Whereas Rav Lichtenstein dealt with the absolute truism, his eternal truths. I feel like you could take everything Rav Aaron wrote and put it back into the 16th century and it still have the same relevance. But when he started to offer social criticism about various communities, he was very harsh on his own community, much more forgiving and tolerant towards other communities. I think you have to be able to assess, as your question insinuated, to assess whether it's still relevant. I think, again, I'm going to broaden the question beyond particular communities for 2 reasons, because I think it's relevant to every community. How intensely do you feel avodas Hashem? How foundational is avodas Hashem? Some people it's very intense, but it's not foundational. You have these very deep moments and profound moments of avodas Hashem, but then you walk away from the religious space. So it's a combination of intensity and foundational, seminal. How deep is it in practice? How deep is it in faith? I think we've moved as a society towards a type of avodas Hashem, which places a very, very heavy emphasis on mitzvot and ma'asim, how we perform mitzvot, and the shiurim, and the shiur of our tzitzis, and the shiur of our lulav. And for all sorts of reasons, we don't have how many hours of Amunah that you have when you're studying in high school, in some cases even in the yeshivos. I mean, I don't mean Musar, and I mean real Amunah, and to build that inner world where you feel like HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence is there. So it's not just expressed in practice, it's also expressed in faith, and feel like HaKadosh Baruch Hu's presence even when you're not performing a mitzvah. So I think those are very compelling questions, they're perennial questions. I think they cut across ideological boundaries. I think also in particular, right now, September 1st, 2025, Erev Rosh Chodesh Elul, we're living at such a sensitive moment in Am Yisrael, not just based on the enemies we have externally, but internally we're so divided and there's so much pain around, especially around the issue of serving the army, not serving the army. It's just, I don't want to talk about different communities because it's just going to add to sin. I'm just going to add to, anyway, people are going to feel if there's this sharp divide between communities. I don't feel that that's appropriate right now to start to differentiate between communities because these are cross-communal issues. All that being said, I don't think you can cut and paste on what Rav Aaron said in 1987 to life in Eretz Yisrael. Rav Aaron was referring to centrist orthodoxy, or what some people call modern orthodoxy in the 80s. We're living in a very different reality in Eretz Yisrael. It's not modern orthodoxy. The differences between the two are vast, even given the points of overlap between the two, but they're still vastly different. And I can't imagine that any Yid living in Eretz Yisrael, whether living in Alon Shvut or Beit Shemesh or Bnei Netzarim or Bnei Brak, any of them are forgetting HaKadosh Baruch Hu, especially after this year. I think life in Eretz Yisrael, Tamidei Nei Hashem Malekech Haba, the Tamidei Nei Yisrael Hashem Ayid. You're living with such a threadbare experience, and you're so dependent upon Nisei Shemayim, and life is so fragile, and the news cycle is so rapid, that I think we think about HaKadosh Baruch Hu far more than a modern Orthodox or centrist Jew may have in Rav Lichtenstein's mind in 1987. I think life in Eretz Yisrael provides a whole range of other challenges, such as I said before, the gap between faith and observance. I think a lot of people in the Dati L'mi community, I think we excel in faith. I'm not sure how often that translates into observance and Shveras HaMitzvos. I think the gap between traditionalism and innovation. If you live in a community which believes that 1948 is a new chapter or a new period in history, it's much harder to stress the Masara, much harder to stress returning back to. It's very evident in the names. Even I have grandchildren with names that my grandparents wouldn't dream of giving. If you live in Chutz La'aretz, you give your name of your grandchild, the grandfather, the great-grandfather, David Yitzchak ben Yaakov. And Eretz Yisrael is a whole new repertoire of names based on nature, based on Tanakh, based on Jewish history. And it's harder to feel traditionalism in a world of innovation. And also the balance between conformity and individualism. I think that Israel breeds individualism. You have to be stout and courageous and very strong-minded to live in this country. And it's harder for strong-minded people to then be Mevato Ritzoncha V'nei Ritzona. And Eretz Yisrael, that balance of independent identity versus conforming to the will of another, whether it's the will of a Masara, the will of Rabbanim, the will of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's much harder. So I think there's a whole range of different questions which our community faces. I don't know the Haredi community that well, but I think these are questions which is slightly different form that apply to them as well. But to answer your question, I don't feel like people in my life, people that I encounter, forget their bonus show. I feel that they're walked in with their bonus show. In ways that maybe, even Mervami my Rebbe told me that in the 19th century, many Reformed and conservative Jews in Britain had a celebration Yom Kippur night called Nidrei Neshef, the called Nidrei Ball, because they wanted to undercut the sanctity of Yom Kippur. So they stayed up all night dancing, and they came with their best clothing. And then there were even more radical anarchists who got upset with the Reformed Jews. Why are you making a Kol Nidrei Ball? It's a regular night. By making a Kol Nidrei Ball, you're highlighting that it's Yom Kippur. So Rav Amital always tells us, even when you rebel against HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's also a Teshuva. So I think there are many people in Israel that are struggling with the bonus show. That's not forgetting Hashem. You can ignore Hashem. You can rebel against Hashem. Those are very different modes of honest Hashem, many different modes of the Jewish mind. So I don't feel that concept speaks to us today.
Interesting. So there's a lot there that I would like to follow up on and unpack, and we'll see what time allows. But when I first read that, and until this day, when I think back upon these words of Rav Lichtenstein, I think about the demographic of people who work for a living. And the Mesilas Yesharim writes that people who are very busy and involved in their business in Parak Hey, it can be a big challenge to their zihirus and their zrizos and their basic focus and headspace for Avodas Hashem. And, even, again, I'm talking about, cross communities and whatever. So Rav Aaron Lopiansky, in his Sefer, which is a much more recent Sefer, in his Akdama, he says that the number one ultimate fear of someone leaving the yeshiva world to go out into business is the fear of a I have the Lashon here. The worst fear that Rav Aaron Lopiansky points out in his Akdama is, but worst of all was anticipating a bleak ruchniistic future, visions of hurried, perfunctory davening, catching a word here or there of Daf Yomi Shirim, and all too often nodding off, a gradual descent into a good life culture. So when I think about Rav Lichtenstein's words and Rav Lopiansky's words, and obviously the Mesilas Yesharim behind it all, I think of this fundamental challenge of those who are involved in the business world to feel connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And even speaking to, Balabatim here in Eretz Yisrael, obviously on a deeper level, there is that default connection that you mentioned, but there's still the practical challenge, which is built in to the life of a Balabas, which is echoed in all of these sentiments. So is there any way around that? Like, it's just, if you're going to be working, you're going to have this challenge, and that difficulty of feeling HaKadosh Baruch Hu present in today's business world is not any easier, or maybe it's harder than it was in 1987.
A lot to unpack in that question also. You touched upon a lot of important issues. Let me start broadly and then address the issue, and then maybe a few comments about the Masil Sishar, which I think is important as well. The yeshiva movement, let's say we tag the yeshiva movement starting in 1803 when the Volozhin yeshiva opened, and picking up real steam in the end of the 19th century, was unparalleled, unprecedented experience in Am Yisrael. And it took Torah from a very, very dormant, languished state, and it superpowered Torah by placing an emphasis on Torah, or it's called Yeshiva Torah and Oli Torah, and this is not a discussion about the yeshiva world, but it provided a lot of energy for Talmud Torah. That's Baruch Hashem, the renewed interest in Talmud Torah and Shras HaMitzvahs in the world we live, and the growth of Orthodoxy, which is a product of the yeshiva world. But it also created certain, let's call it certain mind traps and certain challenges I think people have to climb out from under, especially people that have been in yeshiva. You told me before we started, you just left yeshiva. I mean, I never left yeshiva, but I'm a little older, so I have one more perspective. It created a very, in my opinion, unhealthy bifurcation between yeshiva life and non-yeshiva life, intentionally, to heighten the passion and the emotion and the drive and the celebration and pride of being a Talmid Chacham in the Keser Torah. And it came at the cost of Balabatim. And even sometimes in yeshiva, you still hear, hopefully not in too many yeshivas, but you still hear people when they want to denigrate an analysis of Gemara, Svara, so let's have Balabata Shesvara. And I know what they mean. They mean that it's not categorical like with Chaim, and it's not something that's going to be connected to the underlying logic of Shas, but just by using the terminology Balabatim, it reinforces a very disparaging view of life as a Balabas. And there's so many areas that this is, I think, plaguing us. My Rebbe Rav Amital told me that when he was in Hungary, he was in a shtetl in Groiswarden, which is a small town in Hungary. So he was very close to the Minchas Yitzchak of Yaakov Yitzchak Weiss. It was one of the big poskim in the 20th century in Chodesh Welt. Well, in between being in Groiswarden and coming to Eretz Yisrael, he was a Rebbe in Manchester. So Rav Amital was a Ben Bayis. He would have a lot of Shabbos meals with Yaakov Yitzchak Weiss in Hungary. And he told him about the Brisker Rav, where evidently Yaakov Yitzchak Weiss ultimately met, but he hadn't known about it. And Rav Amital says, he's a big Rosh Yeshiva, but he's not a posek. And Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak Weiss and Minchas Yisrael was shocked. What do you mean? How could you be Rosh Yeshiva without being a posek? Because when you're in the real world and you have real Balabatim and you're dealing with families, not just the 18 to 30-year-old yeshiva bachrim, you get a certain balance and perspective that you don't get if you're just in yeshiva dealing with theoreticals. And even today, the shift of rabbinical authority has shifted from the Rabbanim in Batei Knesset to Rosh Yeshiva. It's healthy in some ways. Like, who would you consult with if you had a question? The Rav in your shul or your Rosh Yeshiva? But Rosh Yeshivas live very, very upholstered lives, padded lives. You're living in yeshiva. The questions you face in yeshiva are not the same you face in the real world. So I think one of the dangers of the yeshiva world is this bifurcation where yeshiva, the high Yotzel Vavers Hashem, and Balabatim is where you're holding one for dear life, trying to tread water, not to slip and regress, but to at least maintain your stamina, rather than seeing, and when Chazal say, Lo batlo yeshiva me'avosenu, that our Avos always learned, that didn't mean they learned in Volozhin, but they heard yeshiva. They don't mean yeshiva as an institution. They meant yeshiva as an experience, to sit and learn, Yoshev V'Lamed. So when Yaakov learned yeshiva Shem Ba'eber, how many people were in Shem Ba'eber? There weren't throngs of people. He was sitting and learning, probably by himself on a rock, or with a couple other people learning, but it wasn't this official yeshiva that created an institutionalized experience that then turned post-yeshiva into a constant slide. So I think, in general, it's very healthy and important, in general, to assess yeshiva and the yeshiva experience in a sober way, especially for Balabatim. You tell me before that your podcast, Baruch Hashem, is trying to help people make the transition, because it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you think that you're leaving yeshiva, and all of a sudden you're detaching your umbilical cord from any source of religious inspiration, rather than seeing new opportunities, new challenges, as you said before, in the name of Lubyansky as well. So I think it's very important not to make that. Now, getting back to what you said before about the Masil Sisharim, look, it's a supremely important sefer, but it was written in the early part of the 18th century in Italy, by Moshe Chaim Luzzatto. And in that world, there was still a dualism, which I'm not sure many people in our world experience. And I mean, it's as follows: the world of Torah and mitzvahs, and then the physical world of Gashmios, and the world of Averos, and the world of Torah, and the world of the business. And as if there are two spheres. And when we leave the sphere of the base medrash and mitzvahs and Torah, as if we're entering some demonic world where there are forces posed against us. I think if I lived in the 17th and 18th century, I would feel that also. But it's very periodic. When I live in the 21st century, I don't know if you feel that way. Maybe you do. Maybe people reading Rabbi Lupiansky's Sefer do as well. But I don't feel that way. In part because of Hasidus, because I think the influence of Hasidus has homogenized all of our experience. And I feel like I'm standing in front of a Kodesh Baruch Hu every moment. When I'm in the base medrash, the last 2.5 weeks, you know how much Torah I was able to learn? Very, very little. You know my avodas Hashem? I took care of my grandkids, whose father is up north, developing our people, literally all day long. I was running a diner and a dish cleaning operation. That's my avodas Hashem for that moment. I didn't feel like I thirsted for Torah. My kishkis thirsted to learn and to grow in that respect, but I didn't feel like a Kodesh Baruch Hu was looking at me any less. And I didn't feel like walked away from my avodas Hashem. And I think some people listening to this, when they read the Mesilas Yesharim, more of the smart with that time, and you pick up this almost dichotomy and bifurcation between the world of Ruchnius and the world I never use those terms. I don't feel there's a world of Ruchnius and Gashmius. I'm an Avodah Hashem. I try to be the best Avodah Hashem I can be, whatever context I find myself. I know there are moments that are deeper and more pointed in charge, like when I'm learning adopting, and other moments that Seven Hashem through Midos Tavos and through relationships of being a kind person, being a polite person. And I think it's also not just the change of Hasidus, but the gap between the world of Gashmius and Ruchnius in the 18th century, because Gashmius was such a Spartan, difficult world. The physical world was so dark and was so drudgery. And I mean, today, you can parrot those divisions in Ruchnius and Gashmius, and then you go out. Imagine starting reading the Mesilas Yesharim. Now, the world outside is horrible, and only the world inside is kosher, and the world outside is full of malachim treifos, and we have to be careful. And then you close in the Mesilas Yesharim, you get into your SUV, you go to a restaurant and go to a Yankee game. There's a gap, there's a cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance is the death knell of integrated avodas Hashem. Integrated avodas Hashem means you want to feel that you're the same Oved Hashem every single second. You're Omed L'Fnei Kadosh Baruch Hu. The expressions are different. So it's a supremely important sefer. Trust me, I have the sefer Mesilas Yesharim literally on my shelf. I just brought it back from the base medrash. So I was learning over the summer. I think some people read it and they don't ask sufficiently, well, does this represent my current world? And if it doesn't, how could it influence that world by giving me a voice from a different world that just reminds me not to overindulge? So I think a long-winded answer to your question, I think there are adjustments that have to be made, but the attitude has to be not one of tragedy and not one of taking a passport to enter a new realm, but trying to diversify and alter the frequency of your avodas Hashem now that you're not in the base medrash, which you won't be much of your life.
Right, but I guess the last piece of that puzzle, which still needs to be understood a little better, is the fact that even speaking to, alumni of Yeshivat Har Etzion, wonderful guys who have young kids in their junior level positions, and they feel this challenge. If they use maybe different terms to express it, but the fact that they're busy, they don't have a lot of time and energy for their learning and for their davening, and they do feel lacking in that regard. So all of those things being true, it's still people, their experience that they talk about, at least from my conversations with them, that still is something that they struggle with. Again, granted that on a deeper level, especially being in Eretz Yisrael, can have much deeper implications and meaning, but on a very practical day-to-day level, they're busy, they can feel stressed and challenged by these different things. So how do you approach that last final halacha l'maaseh piece of this?
Al mishkavi balilo. So when you put your head down at night, you have to think about how much of my day gave nachas ruach to Kodesh Baruch. And the metric for that can't be how much Torah you learned. Obviously, you can't walk away from Talmud Torah. And then the Rambam, when he writes Nechas Talmud Torah, I remember hearing from one of my Rebbeim, Rambam writes, you have to learn Talmud Torah. The Rambam says, Afilu bal isho banim. Even if you're married in children, as if that's the final frontier. The hardest person, the biggest challenge to the person is isho banim. So everyone has that challenge. You have to find the time to learn and find. But I think you have to validate to yourself. That's what I was saying before. In yeshiva, the metric for success is how many hours did you learn, how many hours did you mevatel Torah. It's a binary world, And bittul Torah typically is not learning and not being productive otherwise. Whereas in life, the metric has to be, when I was at work, did I work in an honest way? Was I kind to the people around me? Did I make brachos with kavanah? Did I attend davening? Was I quiet in shul, right? Like you said before, it's hard sometimes to have kavanah in davening, but it's not hard to be quiet in shul. It's not hard to respect the Kadosh Baruch Hu. I'm shocked when I see the way B'nai Torah, especially, I think we as Anglo-Saxons, we were trained to have proper regard in shul. For some reason, there's this dissonance. I see a lot of Israelis, I don't want Chas V'Shalom be motzi las, but I see a lot of people who in the general life, they're really very serious about their avodas Hashem, but they come to shul and forget violating times you shouldn't be talking, but just, I walk into shul, I don't say a word. Period. I don't say a word other than tefillah, because I'm standing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And my standing with HaKadosh Baruch Hu begins when I enter the shul, and it ends when I leave shul. It has nothing to do with my davening. It's a separate mahalach to stand for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Maybe tinted glasses, and I never left yeshiva, so I'm not the person to speak about it, but I just feel like you have to diversify, and the metric can't be how many hours of Torah you learned. It has to be, in your darkest and most honest moments, do you feel you're a good, kind, Oved Hashem, who did the right thing and had the right midos, and were kind to your wife and kind to your children and kind to people around you. And I think it's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants.
Okay. The next idea that I wanted to discuss, that it also touched on a whole bunch of things that you mentioned, is the fact that the Rambam in Hilchos Teshuva, he speaks about the importance of Bechira Chavshis. And he speaks about it not in the narrow sense of, did you eat the cheeseburger or did you withhold the urge, but he speaks about it in a much deeper sense of who you are, what your personality is. I believe Rav Soloveitchik has a phrase in Al Teshuva where he calls it being the architect of your own life. And in yeshiva, hearing that in Shana Aleph, Shana Bet, blew my mind, and it touched such a deep chord, because my life's ahead of me. I have no other obligations. There's really so much freedom lying ahead. And how do we apply that idea to beyond yeshiva? I already have a family. I already have a job. I already have a community. I'm so established. And there are Yechidei Skula who will throw everything away and go become a Breslover Chassid in Tzfat. But for most people, that's not the reality. So how do they apply that idea once they're already more, what's the good English word? Muvrag. Once they're already more established and settled in their lives?
Look, before I answer your question, it is a time, as you said correctly, to celebrate Bechira Chavshis. And to celebrate Bechira Chavshis is part of Tzelem Elokim. And Tzelem Elokim, a lot of people get caught up on that phrase. Tzelem Elokim doesn't even look like Hashem. Chas v'shalom. Elo demos hagof, en lagof, en la sigma mesigi hagof. It means that Hashem is different from nature. He's not part of the system. And there's only one part of nature that's different from nature, like he's different. Hashem's difference from nature is that he's not physical. We're physical, but we're different from nature because we have all these traits that nature does in trees, plants, rocks, and animals. And at the top of that pyramid is creativity and consciousness and conscience and awareness and morality and relationships and creativity. But the top of that is free will. And as you said before, the Rav Zatzal felt that by exercising free will, you're becoming closest to their Rebbeinu Shalom. So you have to celebrate free will, not just from a humanistic standpoint, but to see that that's what the Rebbeinu Shalom wants. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he gave you that gift. He wants you to exercise it. And it's frightening. Look, the world feels much larger and more rigid than ever. I feel that people your age and people younger, it's harder for them to identify free will. For all reasons, the world is getting smaller and larger at the same time. By shrinking communication, the world feels large and feels... I remember when I was younger, it felt like the whole world was a template and waiting for people to impact it and to shape it and to innovate. And it's not just the Rambam, it's also Yirmiyah. It says Yirmiyah in the third parak of Eicha. Yirmiyah says that Teshuva is the moment of exercising Bechira Chavshis. Those are the three psukim actually the Rambam quotes in Parak Gimel. Hashem isn't responsible for decision making against Calvinism with the predeterminism. Therefore, a person should mourn and feel sorrow for their poor decisions. And then, what's the third part? Acquire, inspect, and return to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, it's not a time for Teshuva. It's a time for thinking about why Hashem made us free, how have we used that freedom, and how can we better use that freedom. And the lens can't just be mitzvahs and averos. The lens could be, what types of decisions have I made in life that are correct and incorrect outside of the orbit of mitzvahs and averos? What opportunities have I missed? If I miss an opportunity, is that an avera? What bad decisions have I made? What bad traits have I acquired? Even if they're not averos, they're just traits that I'd rather try to improve. So I think, as you correctly said, it's so important to broaden Teshuva. That's why there are places B'chir Chachis in Nechas Teshuva. So much of the B'chir Chachis in the middle program. Over Adam Holver, Rishus and Sira Lodnis, Moshe Rabbeinu, and it's Perk Zion, okay. So I think, as you said, it's correct, and I think that answers your question. This is a podcast for people that have spent time in yeshiva. So if I use the jargon of Tzvei Nidam, Chalik, free of will, B'chir Chachis, and the two different halachas. In terms of freedom of action, you're right. A 17-year-old has much more latitude than a 30-year-old, because he can alter his or her entire arc. He can decide to, as you said, run off to Tzfad or sequester themselves in a base medrash or join the army, whatever large, grand goal they feel will dramatically add purpose and meaning to their life. And when you're a little older, you're Baruch Hashem shackled to responsibility, and responsibility for the Oved Hashem is not a handcuff. It's a reflection of nobility. The more responsibility you have, responsibility is nobility. The more responsibility you have, the more nobility, because you live for people beyond yourself. But in terms of not freedom of decision, how you're going to change your arc, but freedom to change yourself, you're so much more capable as an older person, because change requires emotional intelligence. Change requires self-awareness. Every fate has a deep, deep emotional root. Yazov Rashad Darko v'yashav b'machshavosaf. The Navi is not talking about to avoid the maisin. It's to have to avoid the derech hachet, what leads you to chet. And very often, the emotional trigger is completely unrelated to the physical manifestation. If let's say you're a person that continues to fall to this chet, so you're going to trace it linearly. It probably comes from the following need psychologically. But very often, it's completely unrelated. You have fears, insecurities, things in your past that went wrong, and you have a need, and you fill that need in some way that takes you years to associate the two, years to understand, why do I behave this way? You could try to eliminate the externals, the internet or the friends, whatever externals you feel, but faith that gets very deeply rooted will find another way to grow. Like what do they call it? Like what they said, like the opposite of grass. Like English is like weeds. So it'll grow like weeds unless you uproot it entirely. And that is something that, as you mature, you're far more empowered because you understand yourself. So if you look at free will in a myopic way, can I make a change? Well, I'm married, I have children, I have grandchildren, I have a job, I have a wife. I can't just find a new hilltop to live on. But if I say there's so much to grow within the parameters of the life I've chosen, and until I even get to, maybe one day I'll get to the point where I've maxed out on being the person within my limit, then I'll say maybe I should go to a mountain. But I don't think I ever will. I think that I can spend my entire life trying to chase my best self within the life that I'm hitched to, and I'll really never get there. And not just in performance, but in self-awareness and changing my personality. And on top of that, in Parshas Kisava, which we read a little bit before Rosh Hashanah, so after the halacha, Bikurim, and Rami Ovid Avi, a person every third year brings their Trumas Samaisus to Yerushalayim and says, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayis, which is a exclamation. What do Chazal call that? It's not in the Torah, obviously. They call it Vidur Maisus. Very strange that accounting for yourself and announcing that you've fulfilled your duty is called a vidui. Typically, we think vidui is a heartfelt confession about our failures. The answer is, for vidui to be authentic, then it has to be balanced, or else you're false confessing. And for it to be balanced, you can't just confess your failures, you also have to acknowledge your successes. And that's something which, when you're young, you're not mature enough to, because it's very hard for you to be multifaceted emotionally when you're young. You feel like it's Yom Kippur, I'm going to beat my chest until I beat myself into futility and into inefficacy. But when you're older, it's easier to balance. Say, well, this is what I have accomplished, and this is what I still have to accomplish. And then you reach a level of honesty. So I think the honesty gradient, or the honesty quotient, and the ability to make real personality change is very different when you're older. So I think that you are free, but in a very different way.
Wow. So you sort of answered my next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway and see if you have anything to add specifically on this point, which is that in the Vidui of Yom Kippur, we say at the very end, Ad shelo notzarti eini kedai, v'achshav shenotzarti ki'ilu lo notzarti, which Soloveitchik and others have pointed out indicates this idea that we have this unique role to play, unique tafkid that Kadosh Baruch Hu wants specifically from each of our neshamas in the generation that we live in. And we talk about coming out of yeshiva. I definitely think this is a great opportunity because in yeshiva, you are fundamentally part of a pretty rigid and structured environment. Even if yeshivas talk about individual attention, fundamentally, most of your day is this seder and that seder, and there isn't as much room for finding your inner tafkid, your inner your personal role. But I feel like I struggle with this idea sometimes of having a unique tafkid. I think for a number of reasons, but I think the main one is the maybe shallow discourse that people in the Western world have about finding your passion and finding your calling, and a lot of these cheap slogans about how to make the most of your life. So you touched on it a little bit, but I think I wonder if you give you a little more guidance about people who are post yeshiva and have more of that, are less tethered in their religious life to a structured yeshiva environment and are trying to find their unique tafkid in this world, and especially now the Yom Norah, and make sure that they're zoning in on that and focusing on that.
It's a good question, but I'll just, before I answer the question, remind you, that's not the literal reading of the end of Vidor. It's the reading that Rav Soloveitchik and Rav Kook added. Literal reading is, there's no reason for me to be born into this world. And now that I've been born into this world, I failed Rabban Shalom. It's a moment of self-diminution and our humility and Alpha Vapor. It's like it's a modern version of Alpha Vapor, Alpha Vapor. And one of the midas of Am Yisrael is that one of them. Salvation, as you said, added to it that before I was born, I wasn't suited to be born to this world. Now that I'm born to this world, here is Michala v'Tashameh. So
I appreciate that correction.
It's important for people to feel the nivos of a life that hasn't lived up to expectations. In terms of the question itself, which I think is an important question, I'm very averse to using that word tafkid in life, and I'll tell you why for two reasons. The first is for the same reason I'm averse to the word bashert, because it throws a monkey wrench into the decision-making process that's very unhealthy for people looking. Does HaKadosh Baruch Hu know who a person is going to marry? Of course, because he has foreknowledge. But it's like everything else, he knows who a person will choose. So in the end, who's the bashert? The person you choose. Hashem knows there's a baskal that's yotze, but we don't hear that baskal. So the fact there's a baskal yotze when a person is born, who are they going to marry? So when I choose someone to marry, should I choose based on physical attraction, midas, family, common interest, suitability, or should I say, well, maybe they're my bashert, maybe they're not? And you can get endlessly lost in adding an additional clause to your equation, which not only you'll never know, but is the consequence of the decision. That clause is not part of the decision. It's the consequence of the decision. Once you make the decision, Hashem knew that was the decision you made. It's the same thing with the tafkid. A person can go through life and constantly question, is this my tafkid? Is it not my tafkid? And be trapped by that question. And there was an 19th century English author that was fond of quoting Henry James. So Henry James wrote a small novel called The Beast in the Jungle. It's one of my favorite Elul novels. It's about a young man who has a premonition that one day he's going to accomplish something very great and very surpassing. And because of that premonition, he can never make any decisions, because every decision is held up to, will it serve that great accomplishment or will it diminish? And he ends up being trapped by the beast in the jungle, which is the prophecy, the premonition that traps him into paralysis. And I think it's very dangerous to ask. The second reason is, and this I'm extremely worried about, is what I call the Korach syndrome. Korach also had a premonition that he had a tafkid. V'ikach Korach, or what Chazal say, v'Korach shepikach ha'ir lama l'shtus hazeh. So let's say enough hiteo. He had this nivuah that great people would come from him, and his children would stand on the dofen and say shira with the Levium. He said, "Wow, I must be destined for greatness and destined for glory." And he didn't realize that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has many different algorithms by which he can make these destinies fulfill, and doesn't necessarily revolve around you. And ambition, to me, is one of the most dangerous traits we face, because it announces itself as a noble trait. When I feel pettiness or greed or lust or hunger, whatever I feel, I know this is a negative trait, a toxic trait. Sometimes I'm strong enough to overcome this, sometimes I'm not. But I know that I'm at war, and not at war, but I'm battling something which shouldn't express itself. Nobility, ambition and aspiration it sneaks into our noble self and it announces, well, you're destined for greatness and you have a tafkid. And therefore, we're willing to cross all sorts of moral red lines and trample all other people because we feel that the free world will collapse if Moshe Taragin doesn't give the share or Yaakov Wolf doesn't give the podcast. So I think that word tafkid is very volatile. It could be entrapping. So I like to live life inside out. What I mean by inside out is as follows. Start with the little things. Work on Avdilika Jibrachu. I always give this reductionist mashal to my Talmidim. Let's say Hashem took you and put you on a planet by yourself, and all you'd have was food and a base medrash and a mitzvah story. You could buy all your mitzvahs. Would your life change, or would you say, I'm still in Arbat Hashem, I'll still keep Shabbos, I'll still perform mitzvahs, I'll still learn Torah, I'll still work on my midos, or desert islands, the same thing. Now you're in this world, and this world provides challenges, but don't predicate your life upon your tafkid. Predicate your life upon simple, common, baseline avodas Hashem. Then, here's the key point. If there's a moment in which need meets talent, and you don't have to be aggressive or exploitative to serve that need with your talent, those are the two conditions. You're invited to the ball rather than crashing the ball. Then try to not just work at the foundation of Shura Satara Mitzvahs, but then try to serve a need. But be very, very grounded. Right? Chazal say, B'shas kanes pazer, B'shas pazer kanes, which means many things, but in a general sense, when there's expansion, contract, when there's contraction, expands, the Gemara and Brothers mean a lot of things, but Chazal telling us to assess the situation. What does Am Yisrael need right now in the current context? And if you feel you can provide something, and you feel there's a desire for it, then serve it. But to hold tafkid as the existential lens by which you judge your life, I think is very, very, very perilous. The existential lens is the basics. That could be true in the 14th century, in the 28th century, in the 3rd century. You're living as I in the 21st century, what expectations can I meet? But that's not the central pivot of identity. I don't know what I show.
I really like that. And I think it also requires a great sense of patience. And it's something that through this podcast, speaking to Balabatim who have accomplished various things, oftentimes it comes out that they found these tafkidim, but it took them a while. And without that sense of, as long as it takes for that opportunity and need and things to come together, it could take a while, but that's okay, as you correctly pointed out.
When I made Aliyah in 1993, so Baruch Hashem, I was at a stage in my life in which many, many opportunities in America were opening themselves up to me. And you could really say that I had a path to, I hate the word path to success because I'm not looking for success, but a path to meaningful life as Klei Kodesh, I think many people would dream of. And I made Aliyah to nothing. I wasn't offered any job to be a Rebbe. I came with my wife and 2 little children, and like everyone else, I taught an hour in this institution, in this seminary, this yeshiva, here and there. And I looked at myself in the mirror when I made Aliyah, and I said, you have to be content moving to Eretz Yisrael, raising your children, to be Obdei Hashem, living a life of kindness and compassion to your wife and your family, and learning Torah as much as you can, and that has to be enough for you. And even if you never accomplish anything else in your life, that has to be sufficient in your mind. Now, I hope I've accomplished something. I don't know if I've accomplished as much as I would have accomplished in America, but that inner voice inside of me I find very grounding, and other things in my life I find very grounding. It's not about the tafkid and who's going to be the world champion of this rabbinic college. It's going to just be me and HaKadosh Baruch Hu looking in the mirror and trying to say, have I fulfilled my chiyuvim to the Rebbeinu Shalom in a way that makes him proud.
I find that very moving and very powerful and very helpful to me personally. So thank you for that. You gave this interesting mashal of being sort of on a desert island and having to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that leads to a question and a dynamic between our personal ambitions and focus on our own bein nila bein atzmi as far as serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu and doing tshuva in that realm, versus another realm which is our connection to the klal and being nosei b'olim chavero and betoch ami anochi yoshevet. How should we think about that in this current moment? What are your thoughts about the Jewish national identity that we are seeing develop now post October 7th?
It's an excellent question. I just read a weekly article for the Jerusalem Post, which gets carried in a couple of Jewish weeklies, and it was the topic of my article. And this mamish this past weekend over Shabbos, so I'm happy you want to send the link to people. I don't want to be listening to this. It's certainly a question that becomes much more acute as we transition from the past 11 months to Elul. Let me take a few steps back. Obviously, we're products of both our individual identity, our values, our goals, our relationships, just the Kadosh Baruch Hu, relationships with our people in our orbit, our radius, relationships with ourselves, our self-experience. And we're also products of larger communities and frameworks that we belong to, families, communities. In the case, as I said before, I'm a cosmic nation that stretches throughout the generations, not just the people we're living with, but the people that lived before us and the people that will live after us. And you're absolutely correct. In the Chutz, it's hard to feel that. So the personal identity surfaces more than the collective identity. The Eretz Yisrael, where you feel like you're living in a land of history. I don't think any of us in Eretz Yisrael feel that we're living in 2024. We happen to be inhabiting 2024, but we're living in a land that has been part of Jewish dreams for thousands of years and Jewish settlement before a couple thousand years ago. And one day we'll witness the Kiryat Yisrael and the Torah B'Shechina. And also as the epicenter of Jewish identity, I feel Jews in Argentina and Jews in France and Jews in Ireland and Jews in whatever much more deeply than I would if I lived in Tina, Ekwa, and the Five Towns. And probably the best example of that is the contrast of Soloveitchik's world in Machshav with Rav Kook. Soloveitchik is very existentialist, he delved deeply into the heart and soul of our personal relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu. Just look at the titles of his Smarim Machshavit, Halachic Man and Lowly Man of Faith, and it's all about man. And Rav Kook is very collectivist and very universal and very tzibur-driven. And for sure, as he said, and that's why identity here is much more national and collective. Those are all the benefits and disadvantages with everything else. And I think that Anglo-Saxons, or with Israel, are uniquely empowered to try to blend the two because we have the past and we have a current world that is so different in that tonality and that frequency. In general, in terms of Teshuva, if we're in 2024, it's also a very important moment. I think so much about Teshuva is not coming to a resolution, of juggling multiple ideas and emotions that are in tension with one another. Our relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu is not unidimensional because we're so different from him. And ultimately, the next 40 days is about heightening the decibel level of that relationship. And it means there's so many parts of our relationship where you're going to feel one emotion, one moment, and a different emotion, one attitude, a different attitude. And it's embracing those paradoxes rather than trying to resolve those paradoxes, which I think is an underlying feature of Soloveitchik's Machshava. For Soloveitchik, paradox is not, and religion is not meant to be resolved. It's meant to be maintained because it reflects the dichotomy or the disparity between ourselves and Baruch Shalom. You and I are both human beings, so either we like each other or we don't like each other. Kadosh Baruch Hu is so different that there can't be one single frequency at which we interact with one another. So in Teshuva as well. Teshuva is a dark descent into the night of the soul, and it's a very personal moment. You read David HaMelech and Tehillim, there's very, very little collectivism. There's very little. I mean, this is raw, personal. He wakes up in the morning, the day after, looks in the mirror, sees a monster, and decides he has to make a change. And to his credit, he pours his heart out. And he takes us along the journey through a very dark tunnel of doubt and uncertainty and inadequacy and self-mortification. That's what I feel. I feel all of those are over Elul. But it's also, as the Rambam says, Teshuva l'kol, li'achad v'l'rabin. And there's so much that as he insinuated before and intimated before of in the days of the Beis HaMikdash, Yom Kippur was not a personalized experience. More or less, people came to the Beis HaMikdash, stood shoulder to shoulder, watching the Avodas Yom Kippurim, waiting for the Chut HaShani to turn white. He said the Sarah Lazazel, the Rambam Paskins. The Rabbah is very fond of quoting the Rambam Paskins that the Sarah Lazazel is Mechaper L'Shavim V'Sheid, both for people who perform tshuva and don't perform tshuva. Okay, it's Shittas Rebbeud in the Gemara Yoma, but there's a collectivist kapara that you can only achieve by heightening your identification with Am Yisrael and heightening the Ahava. When I say, Kadosh Baruch Hu, I want your love to cover my chatayim, I don't think of the love he feels for me. I don't know if there's enough love there to cover all my chatayim. But I think of the amazing love he feels for our people and how much more of his love we deserve after the last year, and how much more of his love we deserve after the last 80 years. And I say, Kadosh Baruch Hu, I think you have more love for us than I have chatayim. And I want that love to cover my chatayim. So I think this duality that you surfaced is really important during Elul. I think this year it's much harder because the last 11 months we have lived much more collectivist. And we've been together saying Tehillim and crying together and commiserating together and attending one of values together. And I think it has allowed us to drift a little bit from the personal world of how often have we thought this year, where the crisis struck, how are my mitzvahs performing? Have I performed too many averos? How much have we almost acquitted ourselves from personal accountability because we're so swept up in this torrent, in this tidal wave of a tragedy that's affecting our people, it's affecting Jewish history. Our terminology is different. The emotions, right? Think about the emotions you felt the last couple of months that I felt: dread, fear, uncertainty, danger, doubts, questioning Hashem, frustration. And then when I try to think about the emotions I feel under normal Rosh Hashanah and Kippur in my own personal space, it's shame, it's guilt, it's darkness, it's embarrassment, it's sorrow for lost opportunity. I don't feel sorrow for lost opportunity the last year. I feel like there's sorrow for tragedy. And I'm scared. To be honest, I'm very frightened. Will I be able to shift into those emotions, and that will I be able to conduct al-Chait and Hashamdo without immediately drifting to the larger issue that has dominated every waking moment of the last 11 months? I don't live anything but our collective suffering, a collective tragedy, and a collective history. So this year I'm really worried. I don't know what the solution is. I just hope we'll find, I hope Hashem forgives us if we're not able. I think we're human beings, and I don't know how much of the personal tshuva I'll be able to feel suffering and crying. Today I just woke up, I've been holding back tears all day long, and it's not about my own inadequacy. It's about Am Yisrael's collective pain.
Okay, so that we will link to the show notes. The sefer that you wrote about Jewish national identity is called Dark Clouds Above, Faith Below by Moshe Taragin, available from Kodesh Press, and we will include that in the show notes. The other book that I want to discuss with you before we wrap up for today is a book which you've been working on for longer about the topic of Geula. So if we're talking about national identity and we talk about the arc of history and where the Jewish people are coming from and where we're going to, so we think about the Geula. And I guess I would frame the question as, what are the biggest mistakes, the biggest misconceptions that people have when it comes to thinking about Geula, anticipating Geula, and working to bring the Geula?
It's an important question. I think it goes back to what I said before about the dualities and the tension. The Gemara says in Yomam Pigab, Gedola, Teshuva Shemekarbes Esagula. So Teshuva is a catalyst for Geula. Yet when the Rambam describes the Geula in Parak Zayin, I think it is, the Rambam interprets the pasuk "V'shavta Hashem Elokecha Nitzav," not as a mitzvah, which the Ramban interprets a mitzvah for tshuva. Famously, it's not clear whether the Rambam believes there is or isn't a mitzvah to perform tshuva. He views "V'shavta Hashem Elokecha" as avtacha. Rambam's lashon is "V'sof Yisrael lasos tshuva b'sof galusa miyadin nigalim." And Hashem is promising us that despite the secularization of so many of our people, one day they'll all perform tshuva. Now we assume they're not going to perform tshuva by going to Panavish and learning itself in the seatless. I'm assuming they'll perform tshuva because Geula will be so overwhelming, and they'll see so much of the Ad Hashem in history that that they'll turn to the Kadosh Baruch Hu. So on the one hand, tshuva advances Geula. Obviously, the more tshuva, the more Torah mitzvahs, the closer we are to Geula. Geula is not just how many hilltops in Israel we settle, and how many mitzvahs we bring into this world. On the other hand, Geula is Makar tshuva. That without Geula, we don't expect a full tshuva to happen. And I think there are advantages and disadvantages to both. On the one hand, I would be horrified if I ended my life, chas v'shalom, and the only motivation for my tshuva would be Geula. I would hope that there's a whole range of motivations for my tshuva that would exist even if I lived in Poland, thousands of years away or hundreds of years away from Geula. Shame, embarrassment in front of Kadosh Baruch Hu, moral ineptitude, whatever the motivations for tshuva are, thinking about Yom HaMisa, I would hope that I wouldn't need an overall of history to motivate my tshuva. I would expect my tshuva to be of a higher grade than that. Alternatively, until Geula comes, tshuva won't be wholesale. It'll just be you and the people who are in Shul Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Not necessarily all of Am Yisrael, let alone the Edel Kol Pol Kiata Pealto, the Avin Kol Yitzor Kiata Yitzarto. I think about the offset between the first part of Aleinu and the second part of Aleinu. First part of Aleinu is when Shem Mishtafim Le'el Bavarech, when Achel Korah Mishtafim Waldim, V'ech Machem Lachem, V'yadat HaYom, we know HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the people that are the insiders, the people that know about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what's the second part of Aleinu? Second, Ol Machashakai, V'choben Yevasri Gu V'shmacha, L'tnaseh Gon She'aretz, Give you the Kodesh L'tevo, Ki L'chatachak Koberach. What are you davening for, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? You're davening for Yaakov Wolf to have a life a bracha batzlacha and Yirah Shamayim v'Yirah Schei. You're davening for v'yeda kol pol ki atop li'alto v'yirma kol she'neshem v'yapad Shem Elokei Yisrael Melech. I think that has to be attention. I find at certain points in my Yom Kippur, I say, Kadosh Baruch Hu, I don't care about my life anymore. If I'm davening for the Shechina, it's something larger than me. Take my life or don't take my life. I want the Shechina to make Niskala. I want your presence to be felt more on this earth. And if I revert back to my own Chatayim, it feels like I'm running away from it. But I don't want to run away from my Chatayim and my Teshuva. I want to immerse myself in it. And I don't want that tension to be released. Now, to a degree, that's the difference between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah is not a time for Vido. We don't clap all say. There's not Hashem Beganu. It's more of Malchus Hashem. It's more of Tkiyah Shafar Kolam, Tikucha, for real, Kim Bakarina, Kishem El Yod Aragat, Nachadol Kalaritz. And Yom Kippur to a degree. But in the end, if you're really honest with yourself, even on Yom Kippur, I hope that when Yom Kippur is over, and Hashem won't come and tell me I'm Makabal, you're Salachti, but that Mashiach will come and the whole world will gather with Tkiyah Shofar. So I think that you touched upon a supremely important dichotomy, but tension, and it's supremely important not to flee from that tension, but to, in some ways, empower that tension or employ that tension to suffuse yourself with the energy of these days and your midah from Hashem, which can only be amplified by paradox. Otherwise, if it's one equation, if it's one variable, as you said before, I think when you're older, your mind is more capable of paradoxes than when you're younger, and your mind is more binary. So there's people that feel that they're unable to shift into Rosh Hashanah and Kippur mode because they're not in yeshiva. But look how many capabilities you have now to appreciate the sweep and the breadth of Rosh Hashanah and Kippur that you didn't have when you were 18 years old and just thinking about all your, the fact that you cursed and that you don't know how to grow for.
I have one last question. It really touches upon a whole bunch of things that we've discussed. This is my first Yom Menorah in post-yeshiva, and my wife and I were discussing where we want to be for Yom Kippur. And she was suggesting that maybe we should go back to Keren B'Yavneh. And I actually grew up going with my father to Keren B'Yavneh. He has an alumnus and me as a high schooler, and it was great experiences. And she asked me what we want to do this year. And my gut reaction was to say, as much as those tefillos were amazing, I don't want to be in a space where I'm thinking, davening yeshiva, that's the real thing. And the local shul where I daven every day and every Shabbos, that's, sug bet, that's second grade. If it's not good enough for me to daven on Yom Kippur, then there's a problem there in my approach. And I'm wondering if you want to give me any advice or chizuk to me and the listeners on that tension, because a lot of us have these great memories of the passion and energy and special davenings in yeshiva. But on the other hand, if that's the real thing and everything else is not the real thing, that's also a problem.
In many ways, it's a synopsis of many of the conversations we've had beforehand, and not to bifurcate between yeshiva life and balabatish, and not to create a self-fulfilling prophecy where yeshiva, post-yeshiva life is meaningless and is empty of its meaning. I will say as follows. I think with all that I've said about life outside of yeshiva, I think that Elul is harder. Because in yeshiva, there's an Elul mentality. In yeshiva, people know it's Elul. In part because in most yeshivas, that's when this month begins, and people are coming in with renewed energy. Ritz Hashem tomorrow, or the next 2-3 days, there's going to be a lot of hustle bustle in yeshiva and a lot of awareness that I don't imagine is going to take place in a local shul as deeply, even though you're on shofar, with David Hashem Ori. So I think for Elul, I think it is paramount for people out of yeshiva to find ways to compensate, whether it means returning to yeshiva, even for Seder, or going to a yeshiva in your community. It doesn't have to be returning to yeshiva, just continuing to the people from your community. Now let's go learn for Seder a couple times during Elul in the local yeshiva. It doesn't have to be yeshiva that's your shkafa. It's just going to yeshiva where people are learning and getting ready for Shani Yom Kippur. You could be visiting Maris HaMachpelah, Kever Rachel, or the Kotel in a way that is spiritually meaningful. It could, I think that Elul is harder to recreate outside. In terms of Yom Noraim, as I said before, maybe Rosh Hashanah is easier for mature people because I think the ideas for Rosh Hashanah are much broader and much more intricate and sophisticated in ways that youngsters I don't think understand. Maybe it's harder. But as I said before, it's only Rosh Hashanah. It's easier to stretch the Rosh Hashanah feel outside of shul. A, because the davening is less lengthy, and B, because there is something to be said about creating a Rosh Hashanah spirit at home. Like, what should your table look like in Rosh Hashanah? How should it be different from your table on Shabbos? How should the environment and the mood of Rosh Hashanah? What should your children be doing? What should you be doing when you're not in shul? Whereas Yom Kippur, which is basically being in shul all day, that solution and trying to stretch the Yom Laram Gravitas outside of shul to your house is less available on Yom Kippur. I think maybe reading is something that maybe would be helpful on Yom Kippur. I think there's always a question that comes up. Should you pay attention to the Shliach Tzibur, or should you read a Sefer Derech Hazar Sashatz? And the answer is obvious. Ideally, you should close your eyes and listen to the Tefillah and follow along with the Shliach Tzibur. But I'm willing to give people a heter. If they feel that that's not something that's going to be that spiritually uplifting, to take a Sefer and to read it. And maybe to create your own internal space. It's important to know how to create your own Dalet Amos, your own code of silence, and your own halo. Whether it's in shul and people are talking and not to be angry at them, or whether it's in Shul Yom Kippur and people aren't bringing the same spirit. A lot of people, when they feel that the spiritual moment that they're looking for is compromised by others, they lash out at other people. And you have to know how to go to your own self and your own quiet heart and your own Teshuva L'Kadosh Baruch Hu, and almost block out all the static and all the annoyances and disturbances around. It's easier said than done. But if you can do it in Kippur, you'll probably train yourself to do it during the rest of your life. You'll have a happier life. It'll be less frustrating.
Okay, that's great advice. Thank you, Rabbi Taragin. I didn't mention before, the name of the Sefer on Geula is called Reclaiming Redemption Al HaGeula from Mosaic Press. We will include a link to that in the show notes as well. In addition to Dark Clouds Above, Faith Below from Kodesh Press, we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Rabbi Taragin, it's an honor to have you here on Shark Tank, and thank you so much for taking the time to share these insights with us.
Thank you for inviting me, and everyone should have a meaningful hello, and most importantly, our people should be Zochet to show Senachamos.
Amen, amen.